The airplane, as a military weapon, was employed to a limited extent in World War I. In the battle for Western Europe, Allied pilots like Captain Eddie Rickenbacker prepared to engage Germany's top aviators in the skies over the battlefield. But in that war, the airplane did not contribute much in the achieving of the ultimate victory. 25 years later, the airplane had come of age. In World War II, the airplane assumed a major role in the strategy designed to effect complete victory in the first truly global war. The final knockout punch in the war against Japan was delivered from the air. For almost 4 years of war in the far-flung Pacific, this was the objective of every soldier, sailor, marine, and airman serving in the Asiatic Pacific Theater of Operations. The first attack on Japan was launched early in the war. In April 1942, the U.S. carrier Hornet moved deep into enemy waters to a position only 600 miles from the Japanese coast. The first land base from which raids could be made on the enemy's homeland was put into operation. From China, America's newest heavy bomber, the B-29, could fly to Japan and back in one hop. Other bases, capable of accommodating the superfortresses, were put into operation in India. Thus, the whole of eastern and southern Asia, from Tokyo to Rangoon, was within range of the new U.S. air weapon. In mid-1944, the air attacks on the Japanese homeland were not undertaken for the psychological effect alone. From this point on, the air war was designed to blast Japan into total defeat. From Marianas bases, B-29s would soon be able to attack Japan in some numbers, and the air war on the enemy's home islands could be greatly accelerated. But the building of those bases was a job of far greater proportions than the customary airstrips hurriedly built on newly won islands. On terrain so rugged that the enemy considered the building of a large air base impossible, U.S. engineers went to work on the construction of 3 huge airfields, which were to have a direct bearing on the time needed for achieving the final victory. By November, the first of the massive runways was almost ready to be put into operation. The engineers worked around the clock, putting the finishing touches on the field. In October 1944, the first B-29s touched down at their new home bases in the Marianas. The 6,000-mile flight from California had taken them just 25 hours. For the all-important missions which lay ahead, the crews had trained in Kansas, Colorado, and in the Caribbean. Now they were anxious to put that training to good use.
Well, the first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking. Thank you.
The 21st Bomber Command was ready to go into business. On the morning of November 24th, 1944, the giant planes were readied for their first bombing mission over Japan. 245 tons of bombs in 500-pound packages were loaded into the super forts. This was to be the first mass strike against the heart of Japan. Several hours and 1,500 miles later, the B-29s were over the enemy's homeland. Over Tokyo, the bombardiers went to work. At 30,000 feet, the superforts were reasonably safe from enemy anti-aircraft fire, but not entirely. Over the target area, the planes were attacked by Japanese fighters. Some of the enemy's fighters were knocked out of the sky by the superfort's crews, but more kept pouring in on the big bomber. Mission accomplished, the B-29s headed quickly for their Marianas bases, 1,500 miles away. During those first flights back from the target, the crews of some of the crippled superforts ended up in the chilly waters of the North Pacific. Starting on November 27th, the enemy struck back with a vengeance, attacking the U.S. base on Saipan. The raiders did a fair amount of damage. Some B-29s were total casualties. Many of the enemy raids on U.S. bases in the Marianas were made at night. Meanwhile, on the decks of U.S. carriers in northern Pacific waters, additional raids on the enemy's homeland were prepared by the Navy. The carrier-based pilots of the Navy's fast striking force were assigned targets in the heart of the enemy's industrial areas.
I want to assign specific targets on that factory area. Smitty, bring your second group a little farther east and come down, putting your division on these two large assembly plants. And Sam, knock these big buildings out. Now you have specific targets to hit, and I want you to all get hit.
Already ready for mail plot. Pilots, man your plane.
Okay, boys.
A few hundred miles off Japan, the strike was launched. In no time at all, the planes were over the first of their targets and peeling off for the dive. Other planes attacked enemy airfields. Before heading back, some of the planes went to work on enemy harbor installations and shipping. Inevitably, not all the carrier planes escaped unharmed. In many cases, the pilots managed to bail out successfully. In his rubber boat, the downed pilot had a good chance of survival. Rainwater replenished the limited supply of water each flyer carried. Thus, if the weather were reasonably good, the pilot had a better than even chance of being spotted. In World War II in the Pacific, U.S. submarines performed a valuable supplementary function, spotting and picking up airmen and sailors whose vessels had been destroyed by the enemy. Some 500 U.S. servicemen were rescued at sea by U.S. subs in the Pacific during the war against Japan. With the seizure of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, U.S. fighter planes had a base from which they could easily fly to Japan and return. At the Marianas B-29 bases, preparations were made for heavier attacks against the enemy's home islands, now that the big bombers would have fighter cover over the target area. The operation of the bases from which the raids against Japan were launched became a larger and more complex problem during the early months of 1945. The mapping out of routes to specific targets in Japan for some 1,000 B-29s was only one of the exacting jobs which added to the traffic problem for the operations center of the 21st Bomber Command. This office was a highly geared nerve center in the preparation of the raids over Japan. Shortly before takeoff time, the crews had their targets spotted for them on the radar scope.
Here's how the scope should look when you've located the target and have gain and tilt properly adjusted. Here's your target today. The arsenal is located to the left side of the town. However, since the 3 degrees beam width tends to spread a town out along an axis perpendicular to the airplane, do not aim at the edge of the town, but a little inside the left edge. You can see then that it's important that you hit your initial point on the money and make an accurate turn to the target heading. Otherwise, you may not be able to find your target.
Final preparations for the flight were made in an atmosphere which was always charged with excitement. For the crew members, no mission over the heart of the enemy's homeland ever became routine. The start of another flight on the most dangerous run in the Pacific theater was always a dramatic moment. 300 superforts were ready for the takeoff. The giant planes hurtled down the runway right on schedule. Some 1,500 miles from this island base lay the heart of Japan, the objective of the 300 B-29s in this early April raid. Over Iwo Jima, halfway to the target, the superforts were joined by Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command, based on that island, recently seized by U.S. Marines. The P-51s embarked eagerly on their first mission to Japan. With fighter support, the big bombers were much better able to cope with enemy attacks in the skies over Japan. Sometimes a U.S. pilot got a close look at his recent adversary. The B-29s assigned to hit the Tokyo area usually checked their position by sighting in on Mount Fuji before moving in on the target.
Radar operator, this is Bombardier, over.
Go ahead, Bombardier.
The site's set up. We're ready to bomb.
Roger, out. Pilot, correct 8 degrees right.
Roger.
Bombardier, open bomb bay doors after turn.
Roger.
Get ready on 70 degrees.
Ready on 70 degrees.
Ready on 60 degrees. Mark.
Bombs away.
Tokyo came in for the largest share of attention from the B-29s of the 21st Bomber Command of the 20th Air Force. These mass attacks had a shattering effect on Japan's capital city. In March, the B-29s had an emergency base on Iwo Jima, located midway between Japan and the Marianas fields. Crippled superforts, unable to make it all the way back to their home bases after being hit over Japan, came into Iwo. Some 2,000 B-29s landed at Iwo, some not too successfully. Thousands of airmen who would otherwise have perished were saved at Iwo. The U.S. Third Fleet also closed in on Japan to administer a softening up of the home islands in preparation for invasions by U.S. amphibious forces. Admiral Bull Halsey, the Third Fleet's commander, moved boldly into the waters off the Japanese coast. On July 17, 1945, U.S. and British warships fired some 2,000 tons of shells into the coastal area northeast of Tokyo. The fleet units encountered no opposition during this daring attack on the enemy's homeland. Japan was ripe for invasion. In the United States, before the war, Albert Einstein did extensive research in the field of nuclear fission. Dr. Einstein's findings were developed still further at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory by Dr. Enrico Fermi and his associates, who worked out the process for making plutonium and produced the first atomic pile. In July 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer and his fellow scientists, who had worked on the development of the new secret weapon, prepared themselves for the critical first test. The area was heavily guarded. Doctors Vannevar Bush and James Bryant Conant were among the few spectators.
10 seconds to go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now!
The first atomic bomb explosion was an impressive success. In the Marianas, at 20th Air Force Headquarters, General Curtis LeMay and his staff worked at feverish speed on the planning for the use of the new top-secret weapon against the enemy. If the atom bomb could be safely transported by air to a point over Japan, its use could well have such a devastating effect that the war might be materially shortened. The target was finally selected. The Japanese city of Hiroshima had escaped damage in U.S. bombing raids on the home islands. On that sunny August morning, Hiroshima had no premonition of its fate. On Tinian Island in the Marianas, a B-29 named the Enola Gay prepared to make the first atomic bomb run. Over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the course of world history took a new turn. Hiroshima lay in ruins. Within a few seconds, the sizable city had been demolished by the atomic blast. On August 19th, 4 days after the enemy surrendered, a Japanese plane arrived at Iwo Jima, the tiny island off Okinawa. This was the first meeting between American commanders and Japanese military men since the surrender. The Japanese negotiators stopped off at Iwo Jima to be taken by U.S. transportation to Manila to discuss the terms of the surrender. In late August, preparations were made for the formal surrender ceremony. An excited Japanese harbor pilot was transferred to the Missouri from a ship alongside. On the Missouri, U.S. naval officers carefully studied the charts of Tokyo Bay, which the Japanese pilot had brought aboard. Every precaution was taken to be sure that the Big Mo would be guided safely through the channels to its berth in Tokyo Bay. Meanwhile, at Yokosuka Naval Base, U.S. fighting men went ashore to occupy the conquered country.